The Golden Globes are returning to public view with familiar imagery and a familiar calendar position. The red carpet, the ceremony, and the coverage suggest continuity. What has changed is the structure operating behind the awards and the sequence of events that led to its current form. This account does not focus on winners, speeches, or fashion. It follows order. It tracks how influence formed around the Golden Globes, how scrutiny entered the record through lawsuits and reporting, and how control reorganized once attention intensified. The emphasis remains on timing and process, not conclusions. As with other high-profile disputes in Hollywood, comparisons have emerged. The legal conflict involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni is referenced here only as context, an example of how media narratives, filings, and power dynamics shift after scrutiny begins. The focus in this record remains on the Golden Globes and the organizations connected to them, including the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, HFPA. What follows draws from filings, reporting, and public responses that unfolded across multiple phases. Some moments reached headlines immediately. Others appeared later, through documents that became public only after requests to seal or redact were contested. Together, these entries form a timeline that explains how the Golden Globes moved from controversy to reorganization. No findings are offered here. This is a sequence-based reconstruction. What happened first, what followed, and how the structure now in place differs from what existed before scrutiny entered the public record. Before controversy entered the public record, the Golden Globes occupied a distinct position within awards season. The ceremony was scheduled ahead of the Oscars, giving it an outsized role in shaping momentum. A nomination or win often influenced media coverage, campaign narratives, and subsequent voting. Over time, this placement transformed the Golden Globes from a secondary event into a strategic signal within Hollywood. At the center of this influence was the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, commonly referred to as the HFPA. The organization was composed of a relatively small group of journalists, many representing foreign outlets. Despite its size, the HFPA controlled access to an award that studios, publicists, and agents treated as consequential. That imbalance between scale and impact became foundational. Influence did not develop through formal authority alone. It developed through proximity. HFPA members were granted access that extended beyond standard press interactions. Interviews, invitations, and attendance at industry events became routine. These exchanges were often framed as professional courtesies, but they carried practical value during awards season. Maintaining favorable relationships with voters was treated as part of the campaign process. This structure was widely understood within Hollywood. Publicists coordinated appearances. Studios scheduled screenings. Celebrities participated in interviews even when the reach of the outlet was limited. The benefit was not the publication itself, but the relationship it represented. Over time, this pattern normalized a system in which access and influence reinforced one another. As influence accumulated, so did criticism. Within industry circles, questions were raised about transparency and accountability. These concerns did not immediately lead to formal challenges. The Golden Globes continued to air. The red carpet remained intact. Coverage emphasized continuity rather than scrutiny. Media narratives during this period focused on outcomes rather than process. Winners, speeches, and fashion dominated reporting. Structural questions remained secondary, discussed privately rather than publicly. This imbalance allowed the system to persist largely unchanged. Comparable dynamics have appeared in other Hollywood disputes. In the legal conflict involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, attention intensified only after filings and media coverage shifted the narrative. In both cases, the sequence matters. Influence existed before scrutiny. Relationships were established before questions were raised. Once attention arrived, it encountered structures that were already deeply embedded. The Golden Globes followed a similar trajectory. By the time lawsuits and reporting entered the public record, the underlying system had been operating for years. Control over access, timing, and visibility had already shaped behavior across the industry. Understanding this early phase is necessary to understand what followed. The influence of the Golden Globes did not emerge suddenly, and it did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on alignment between awards timing, media coverage, and industry incentives. When scrutiny eventually surfaced, it did so against a backdrop of established practice. What came next would not be defined by how influence formed, but by how it was challenged, documented, and ultimately reorganized once attention shifted from spectacle to process. The first shift occurred when internal concerns moved beyond private discussion and into formal documentation. For years, criticism surrounding the Golden Globes circulated within industry networks without consequence. That changed when legal filings placed those concerns into the public record, altering how the organization could respond. A lawsuit involving the Hollywood Foreign Press Association marked this transition. Allegations that had previously existed as rumor or anecdote were now structured within a legal framework. The filing itself did not immediately disrupt the ceremony. The Golden Globes continued to operate, and coverage initially treated the situation as peripheral rather than central. What changed was the availability of material. Once filings existed, reporting could reference documents rather than speculation. Requests to seal or redact portions of those filings became part of the process, drawing attention to what information was contested and why. These procedural steps signaled that scrutiny had reached a level where control over access to information mattered. Media response developed in stages. Early coverage summarized claims without sustained follow-up. That posture shifted as additional reporting appeared, relying on documents that were either unsealed or partially redacted. As details entered circulation, the narrative surrounding the Golden Globes began to change. Questions about transparency and accountability moved from the margins toward the center of coverage. Industry reactions followed, but not uniformly. Some studios and publicists adopted a wait-and-see approach. Others distanced themselves publicly, framing their response as conditional on reform. These reactions did not occur simultaneously. They accumulated over time, reinforcing the perception that the issue was structural rather than isolated. As scrutiny intensified, control over messaging became more visible. Statements emphasized commitment to change, while procedural actions focused on managing exposure. The distinction between public assurances and legal positioning became part of the record. Requests to limit disclosure were evaluated against standards governing public access, further highlighting the tension between privacy and transparency. Comparable patterns appeared elsewhere in Hollywood. In disputes such as the legal conflict involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, attention similarly increased once filings became accessible and media narratives shifted. In both cases, scrutiny did not arise solely from allegation, but from documentation that allowed claims to be examined in sequence. For the Golden Globes, this phase marked a turning point. The organization could no longer rely on familiarity or tradition to frame coverage. Legal processes introduced constraints that altered how information circulated. What had once been managed through relationships and informal channels now required procedural response. This period did not resolve underlying questions. Instead, it established a new context. The presence of filings, reporting, and contested disclosures meant that future decisions would be evaluated differently. Scrutiny had entered the record, and with it came a shift from spectacle to process. What followed would depend on how the organization navigated that shift, whether reform would be substantive or structural, and how control would be redistributed once attention extended beyond the ceremony itself. Once scrutiny became unavoidable, the focus shifted from whether change was needed to how it would be presented. Public statements surrounding the Golden Globes began to emphasize reform, transparency, and accountability. These themes appeared repeatedly, but their application followed a measured sequence rather than an immediate structural overhaul. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association acknowledged criticism and announced plans to address it. Messaging centered on improving standards, expanding membership, and modernizing practices. At the same time, legal positioning continued in parallel. Filings addressed disclosure limits, privacy concerns, and the scope of information that would remain public. The distinction between what was said publicly and what was pursued procedurally became increasingly visible. Reform, in this phase, functioned as both commitment and strategy. Announcements signaled responsiveness, while legal actions focused on managing exposure. Requests to seal or redact portions of filings were framed as protective rather than evasive, citing privacy interests and potential harm. These arguments were evaluated within established legal standards, reinforcing the role of process over perception. Media narratives reflected this dual track. Coverage referenced reform initiatives while also reporting on contested disclosures. Articles summarized commitments alongside unresolved questions. The coexistence of promise and limitation created ambiguity, allowing multiple interpretations to circulate simultaneously. Within the industry, reactions remained uneven. Some stakeholders viewed reform efforts as sufficient to justify continued engagement. Others remained cautious, emphasizing that transparency depended on access to records rather than statements. This divergence underscored a broader issue. Reform language could signal intent without altering control. Comparable dynamics have appeared in other legal disputes involving public figures. In the legal conflict between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, arguments about privacy, reputation, and public access similarly shaped how information was released and interpreted. In both situations, the process of disclosure became as significant as the underlying claims. As this phase progressed, reform became a recurring reference point rather than a defined outcome. The Golden Globes continued to operate, while procedural decisions determined which details entered the public record. Attention oscillated between announcements and filings, creating a cycle in which visibility was managed incrementally. What mattered was not the presence of reform language, but its relationship to control. Decisions about what could be examined publicly influenced how accountability was perceived. The system adapted by incorporating scrutiny without fully redistributing authority. This stage of the timeline illustrates how institutions respond when attention intensifies. Change is discussed. Adjustments are proposed. But the underlying structure often remains intact until pressure extends beyond narrative and into enforcement. The Golden Globes were now operating within that space. Reform was part of the conversation, but process dictated outcomes. The next phase would reveal whether that balance would hold once attention shifted from statements to structural decisions. As scrutiny continued, the conversation surrounding the Golden Globes began to move beyond reform language and towards structural outcomes. Attention shifted from commitments and statements to decisions that would determine who held authority going forward. This transition marked a critical phase in the timeline, where control became the central issue. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association faced pressure not only from legal processes and media narratives, but also from industry stakeholders evaluating their continued participation. Studios, networks, and advertisers weighed the reputational cost of association against the practical influence the Golden Globes still carried. That evaluation did not occur publicly, but its effects became visible through actions rather than announcements. Structural change did not arrive as a single event. It emerged through a series of decisions that altered how the organization operated. Control over the awards, once exercised by a small voting body, became subject to external oversight and reconfiguration. These adjustments were framed as modernization, but they also shifted accountability away from collective membership and toward a more centralized structure. Media coverage reflected this evolution cautiously. Reporting noted changes without fully detailing their implications. The emphasis remained on continuity, the return of the ceremony, the preservation of the brand, rather than on the redistribution of authority behind it. This framing allowed the Golden Globes to appear stable even as its internal mechanics changed. Legal context remained relevant throughout this phase. Filings, disclosure standards, and contested access to information continued to shape what entered the public record. The ability to manage exposure influenced how structural decisions were perceived. What was visible was interpreted as reform. What remained unseen shaped control. Comparable patterns have appeared in other high-profile legal conflicts. In the case involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, shifts in strategy followed changes in access to information and narrative framing. In both situations, authority did not disappear under scrutiny, it adapted. By this point, the Golden Globes were operating under a different balance of power than before scrutiny began. Relationships that once functioned informally were replaced by formal arrangements. Decision-making moved further from public view, even as the ceremony itself returned to prominence. This phase underscores a recurring theme in institutional response. Scrutiny can prompt change without dismantling structure. Authority can be redistributed without becoming transparent. The appearance of reform may coexist with a consolidation of control. Understanding these structural shifts is essential to understanding what followed. Once authority was reorganized, the focus moved from responding to scrutiny to sustaining operations under the new arrangement. The Golden Globes continued, not because controversy resolved, but because control had been repositioned. The next segment traces how that repositioning affected participation, access, and the broader ecosystem surrounding the awards. After structural control shifted, the effects became visible not only within the organization, but across the ecosystem surrounding the Golden Globes. Participation, access, and proximity to the awards adjusted in ways that reflected the new arrangement. These changes were not introduced as departures, but as extensions of existing practice. The Golden Globes continued to occupy a central place in awards season. Studios and publicists resumed engagement, recalibrating strategy rather than withdrawing. Screenings, interviews, and promotional activity returned to a familiar rhythm. What differed was the framework governing access. Participation was now shaped by formal processes rather than informal relationships alone. Media outlets played a significant role in this phase. Coverage emphasized the return of the ceremony, the red carpet, and renewed visibility. Trade publications framed the moment as a reset, focusing on outcomes rather than on the mechanisms that enabled them. This emphasis reinforced continuity while minimizing examination of how access had been reorganized. At the same time, procedural elements continued to influence what could be examined publicly. Filings related to disclosure, privacy, and public access remained relevant. Decisions about what information entered the public record affected how the broader ecosystem understood change. Visibility was selective, shaped by legal standards and negotiated boundaries. Comparable dynamics were evident in other Hollywood disputes. In the legal conflict involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, attention similarly shifted toward who could speak, which materials were accessible, and how narratives were constructed once filings became central. In both cases, access determined participation. The role of publicists and studios evolved accordingly. Engagement was no longer based solely on proximity to individual decision-makers, but on alignment with the revised structure. Campaigns adapted, messaging adjusted. The system absorbed scrutiny without abandoning its core incentives. Awards season incentives remained intact. Recognition still translated into visibility, leverage, and momentum. The Golden Globes continued to serve as a signal, even as the organization behind them operated under a different balance of authority. This continuity encouraged re-entry by stakeholders who had previously distanced themselves. What emerged was an ecosystem that appeared familiar on the surface, while functioning differently underneath. Access was formalized, participation was regulated, control was exercised through structure rather than relationship alone. These shifts reduced volatility, allowing the ceremony to proceed with fewer public disruptions. This phase illustrates how institutions stabilize after scrutiny. By redefining access and participation, the system re-established predictability. Attention moved back to spectacle, while process remained in the background. Understanding this broader ecosystem is critical to understanding the final phase of the timeline. Once participation normalized and access was restructured, the question was no longer whether the Golden Globes would continue, but how influence would be maintained once scrutiny faded. The concluding segment examines that outcome, what persisted, what changed, and how the structure now in place continues to shape visibility and power. Once scrutiny began to fade from daily coverage, the Golden Globes entered a phase defined less by reaction and more by continuity. The ceremony remained on the calendar. Awards season resumed its familiar cadence. Public focus returned to outcomes rather than process. What persisted beneath that surface was a structure shaped by the earlier period of scrutiny. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association continued to exist within a revised framework. Authority had been reorganized, and participation adjusted accordingly. While the language of reform remained part of public messaging, the mechanics governing access, disclosure, and control were now established. These mechanics did not require constant visibility to function. They operated through routine. Media narratives reflected this stabilization. Coverage emphasized winners, speeches, and red carpet moments. References to controversy appeared less frequently, often framed as resolved or historical. The absence of sustained attention reduced pressure for further examination, allowing the system to operate with fewer challenges. Legal context, however, did not disappear. Filings, records, and prior disputes remained part of the public record. The standards applied during periods of scrutiny continued to shape how information could be accessed and discussed. What changed was the level of interest. Without active attention, procedural constraints became background conditions rather than focal points. Comparable outcomes have appeared in other legal conflicts involving public figures. In the dispute involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, moments of heightened attention were followed by periods where process continued without widespread coverage. In both situations, influence did not depend on constant visibility. It depended on structure. Awards season incentives reinforced this shift. Studios and publicists recalibrated strategy around the existing framework. Engagement continued because the benefits remained tangible. Recognition still translated into momentum, and the Golden Globes retained their signaling function within the industry. What emerged was not resolution, but normalization. Scrutiny had altered the environment, but it had not dismantled it. Authority persisted, redistributed rather than removed. Access was governed by formal arrangements, reducing unpredictability. This outcome underscores a broader pattern. Institutions rarely resolve controversy through a single corrective moment. More often, they absorb pressure, adjust internally, and continue. Once attention moves on, the changes that matter most are those embedded in routine. Understanding this final phase requires attention to sequence rather than spectacle. What followed scrutiny was not silence, but continuation under new conditions. The Golden Globes moved forward, shaped by what had been challenged, documented, and reorganized earlier. That sequence, how attention rose, how process intervened, and how structure endured, explains why the Golden Globes appear unchanged while operating differently. It also explains why similar patterns continue to surface elsewhere, long after headlines fade. What this timeline shows is not a single rupture, but a progression. The Golden Globes did not end when scrutiny arrived. They adjusted, reorganized, and continued under a structure shaped by that moment. What changed was not the ceremony itself, but the conditions under which it operates. This record does not assign intent or resolve disputes. It places events in order: how influence formed, how scrutiny entered the public record, and how authority was redistributed once attention intensified and then moved on. The same pattern appears across Hollywood. In legal conflicts such as the one involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, attention surged when filings and media narratives aligned, then receded as process continued without constant visibility. In both cases, structure mattered more than spectacle. What remains after attention fades is rarely obvious. It exists in procedure, in access, and in who retains control once headlines no longer apply pressure. The Golden Globes illustrate how institutions absorb scrutiny without disappearing, and how continuity can coexist with structural change. If this breakdown was useful, the next phase of this story will matter even more, because what follows rarely shows up in headlines. It appears in sequence, in timing, and what remains consistent once attention moves on. This isn't a moment that resolves all at once. It's one that continues to shift. And stories like this tend to reveal the most after certainty fades.